views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have a big show today. Starting out, we're going to be talking about the Just Pay campaign. That has to do with getting fair wages for those in the human services section of our economy. Stay tuned. It's very, very interesting. Next up, we're going to be talking about what everybody is speaking about, and that's the slap heard around the world involving Will Smith. We'll have a very famous Los Angeles entertainment attorney on. And lastly, a state senator will be on our show to discuss the New York City's right to really determine their own traffic rules. So as you can see, we have much to get to. Stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. All right, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We're going to start off the show with Michelle Jackson from the Human Services Council, who actually manages 170 not-for-profit organizations. Michelle, thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why don't you start off by telling the viewers a little bit about what your organization does, if you could?
Absolutely. So the Human Services Council, we represent about 170 human service nonprofits in New York City, and we do city and state policy on behalf of those members. So when we say human services nonprofits, we mean everything from childcare to senior centers and everything in between: homeless services, mental health services, home delivered meals, after school programs. So it's a wide range of nonprofits that serve the community, and we really advocate on their behalf at the city and state to get policy changes to better serve communities.
Okay, so at the very basic level, when we're talking about human services, we're talking about employees who have a direct interaction with another human being, right? And those are the individuals, by the way, during the COVID pandemic, who are on the front lines doing the different things in, constant contact with these other humans that other people did not want to do and ended up quarantining all over the place. Yet these human service workers came out on the front lines. These are the workers we're talking about. Am I correct?
Absolutely. These are workers who every day, millions of New Yorkers rely on in communities, and during the pandemic relied on them even more. We saw a huge increase in food insecurity. People needed home delivered meals regardless of their income level because they were immunocompromised or aging and couldn't get to the grocery store. There was a lot of remote learning and after school programs. A lot of nonprofits had to stay open, right, to do homeless services. Shelters and transitional housing don't close in a pandemic. And also we were the ones who did emergency childcare so that other essential workers like doctors, police, and fire could do their jobs.
All right, so let's talk about some of the not-for-profit organizations. You have so many, 170, you couldn't go through them all. But let's just pick a particular not-for-profit, let's say, that runs a food pantry, right? And nobody has enough food. They don't have enough money to go to the supermarket, so they go to the food pantry. And here shows up lovely people who are going to help serve the different people of the community with foods that other people have donated, let's say. How much are they getting paid? Let's give me like an average.
So it really depends, but I'll try to give you an average. I think what we found is that there are a lot of jobs in the human services sector that are, at minimum wage, $15 an hour, or, range between $15 to $20 an hour for like kitchen staff, the people who do home delivered meals, that kind of thing. But also when you go to a food pantry, you're also looking at social workers and case managers who help people to say, why are you coming through our doors? How can we help you? Not just, it's like, give people a meal, but how do we help them? And those social workers who have master's degrees make $35,000 or $40,000 a year.
They should be making much more than that. Okay.
Much more.
So let's talk about the poverty line. When we say poverty line, what do we mean by that?
So we mean HSC and our partners really mean we look at like what is the cost of living in different boroughs in New York City.
By the way, I want to interrupt you a second. Do other people see a poverty line as different? I mean, or is that not a universally accepted term, poverty line?
Well, so there's a federal poverty line, right,
Okay.
which is like what the federal standard is. But, the federal poverty line doesn't apply as much as it would in like rural Ohio as it does in, New York, Manhattan, right?
Of course, I get it now. All right.
we really use a nuanced, what's called like a self-sufficiency standard, which is like looking at the cost of living in New York City. What is the poverty line?
I call it the getting the cup of the coffee. And I live in Manhattan, but my life is in the Bronx. My cup of coffee in Manhattan is $4.50. My cup of coffee in the Bronx is $1. So
Exactly.
that's the cost of living difference, and that would make the poverty line different based on where you would live. But basically, the poverty line, would that be a certain amount of hourly wage, we would say? Like, what would you get to say, okay, that's fair and it's above the poverty line? What number would that be?
Yeah. So again, it really varies across the boroughs. As you said, a cup of coffee in the Bronx versus a cup of coffee. But, we're looking around like $35,000 now in New York City. If you just like kind of, across the board in order to be able to sustain, and this is not like family of four with a car. This is like, what does it really take for a single New Yorker or someone with one child, one partner to survive?
Yeah. Just to get the Metro card, just to be able to get on a bus, just to be able to get to work, just be able to feed their family and not be hungry and not have to go to a food pantry, let's say. All right.
Exactly.
So tell me how you're working this. How are you getting your message across? I understand there are rallies. I'm sure there are people in Albany. Is it a mixture of a lot of different things? How do you do this?
So I think first we are really trying to make the case that government is the predominant setter of wages for human services workers, right? Like they contract out over $10 billion worth of human services to private nonprofits, and they really set the wages and they set them low on the contracts, and providers cannot fill those gaps. So there's 800,000 workers who are under contract with either New York City or New York State. So we represent nonprofits who are tired of paying low wages to their workers, but can't get out of that cycle without government's help. And I think that's the most important framing of this is these aren't nonprofits who want to pay workers a low wage. They're doing their best. And so we're really taking that to our elected officials to say through rallies. We did a really great rally a couple of weeks ago at City Hall. We have a lot of support from the legislature, and Governor Hochul actually included a cost of living adjustment in her executive budget, which is the first one in over 12 years. So cost of living adjustments, regular increases can't go every year without any kind of, cost rise in New York City. And also looking at legislation to make sure that government sets wages at a more appropriate rate.
Well, we certainly have a more progressive government than we've ever had in New York. Maybe not necessarily federally, but in New York. What are the odds that we're going to be able to get these wages up to help the people who've been helping those in the communities of color, Black and brown? I've seen some videos on this. It's heartbreaking. They're doing the work and they then go home and almost need someone to help them. Isn't that really what it's about?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're seeing a lot of change. And I think the pandemic actually helped illuminate how important these workers are. They're over 70% women, over 70% people of color. They work in communities. These are jobs we're not going to outsource anywhere, right? Like this is, as you mentioned right at the top of, this is people-centered work. And I think we're seeing a big shift, both because we recognize them as essential and as we have new leadership at the city and state. We're already seeing some key investments, like I mentioned, the $500 million COLA. But it's a big investment, and people like new shiny programs and not so much, investing in what's already working. So we, see it as a long fight, but a good fight.
You had 170 organizations underneath your umbrella. I wouldn't even begin to think about how you manage all of them. Does some get some priority over others? Is it budget wise? Is it the one, it's the nurses, or should we say it's it's those delivering food? Who do you advocate the most for, or do you?
We do not. We lift all boats together. I mean, this is really comprehensive. The Just Pay campaign is really comprehensive across items. This is saying like government needs to fund these wages. They're the ones who set these wages on the contracts. they have the money and they have the procedures in order to do this. So,
and by the way, we need donations, not just the government coming in there and helping, which we do, but we need the private people to come in at these charity events. I go to a ton of them myself, and to make the donations. That's also goes a long way. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it goes a little bit of ways, but I would actually say that, advocacy with your donation is probably the better piece, because what we're seeing is so for a very quick example, the Department for the Aging released a contract last year that said that social workers should get paid around $35,000 a year in New York City. That's a master's level of education. That's not enough. And so if you are an organization that hires 10 social workers, you have to private fundraise almost $200,000 to just get them where they should be. So that's a huge gap to ask private philanthropy and private donors to make up. So keep making those donations. I would never say don't, but also join us in, our fight to make government pay their fair share.
And how do we do that? Maybe you can let people know. Where do we reach you? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Please join us. You can go to the justpayny.org website and you can sign up for updates. And we have lots of advocacy actions in order to engage elected officials to make sure this happens at the city and state level this year in the budget.
Michelle Jackson, Human Services Council, doing some very, very good work. You should be proud of yourself. Maybe you can come back next couple of weeks and tell me how the rally's been going and whether you've been successful. How's that?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
All right. Stay with us. Today's Verdict has so much more right after this. All right. Welcome back to Today's Verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We are coming from you in New York with someone from Los Angeles, entertainment lawyer Mitra Ahouraian. Mitra, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, keeping up on the news as always.
Quite an interesting week for you, I am sure. Let's just get down to the latest, because from what I'm told, or at least from what I've been reading, it looks like the Academy did make some type of effort to ask Will Smith to leave. True or false?
Apparently true. I mean, I think that, they wouldn't say that if there wasn't some substantiation of that, but it obviously wasn't a firm enough effort to remove him, because perhaps things happened so quickly that they really were probably shaken just as much as Chris Rock was shaken.
Let's break this down into two segments. We got the criminal and we got the civil. So let's start with the criminal aspect of it. Clearly, if there's an assault and battery, that's not hard to dispute. I mean, millions of people saw it. But to press charges, you generally need the cooperation of the witness, right? What's the story here?
Absolutely. I think, in that moment, Chris Rock did not want to embarrass a colleague of his. Certainly, he didn't want to create a debacle where Will Smith is now being carried out in handcuffs during the Oscar ceremony. I think he had some understanding of how big that would be for Will Smith's career and for the, perhaps the entire Academy Awards, the implications that would have. So definitely without that cooperation, he wasn't going to be, taken out in handcuffs. But I don't think that we all expected to see him, get up and get the Oscar and go out and party at the Vanity Fair party afterwards.
Hindsight is 2020. But let me ask you a question. Let's say he was arrested and the police who were there actually did take him in. There'd be a mugshot, obviously. They'd be all over the news. That's a forever mugshot, and nobody wants a mugshot. Maybe Chris Rock was told that also, and he wouldn't want to be the guy to create a mugshot that would be there forever. Is the criminal case basically gone at this point? Does it look like Chris Rock would maybe cooperate at this point? Or does it look like, let's bygones be bygones? I'm not talking about a civil suit, but criminally, I'm not cooperating.
I don't think that we're going to see a criminal suit here. I think that, like you said, first off, the cooperation of the witness is key. Second, if Chris Rock was going to do something, I think he would have said something by now. I don't think that he is so aggrieved that that he would want that to happen for a colleague of his.
All right, let's get into the civil action now. That's the kind of stuff I do. I kind of know it. When we're talking any type of assault, whether it's, bouncers on people in pubs, whatever it is, I've been around that. What's the law out in Los Angeles in terms of a civil action? What would Chris Rock have to prove to be successful in a civil action out in LA?
Well, it's interesting because, in California, you can bring an action for an affliction of emotional distress without having to show physical injuries. Now, some are saying that Chris Rock actually did have some physical injuries on his face when he walked off stage, and certainly when he left the venue. But even absent that, California would allow that infliction of emotional distress. And in fact, it would be an intentional infliction of emotional distress because, Will Smith knew what that was going to do, what that impact was going to do, how that would make him feel while he's on stage. And even having a disregard for what it might do and not thinking about that in the moment, which he clearly did not, would be enough for this kind of claim.
And by the way, not that Will Smith couldn't afford to pay the damages, but insurance doesn't come in when it's an intentional tort in this type of matter. Will Smith would have to pony up. And I would think an element of the damages may be not just the embarrassment, but maybe the fear of getting back up on stage again, that this could happen to him again. Or maybe some people are sympathetic with Will Smith and they don't come out to his shows anymore. It's certainly a loss of income. Am I correct?
Absolutely a loss of income, absolutely some psychological impact about it. He might be, scared of performing at shows, although he did just recently have a show in Boston. But, definitely I think that there is going to be some emotional and psychological impact from what happened on national television with millions of people watching. And I think for comedians all around, there's probably some hesitation of, not crossing the line in some of their jokes, which historically they've done.
Interestingly, the general consensus among all comedians is that this was an improper act and this should never have happened. I think that seems to be the flow here. But how many of those comedians do you think would advocate a civil lawsuit against Will Smith? What's your thoughts on that one?
That would put the comedian in an even more difficult position as a performer. Perhaps, people would be less likely to come to that comedian's shows knowing that they could potentially sue a fan who's paid good money to come see them. Now, of course, that fan is absolutely out of line. And in this situation, it wasn't necessarily a fan. It was somebody who was not a fan of Chris Rock. But I don't know. I mean, I think it would depend on the nature of the injury.
All right. So let's have you look at your crystal ball. We got 2 months from now. Where are we with this case? What's your, we're not going to hold you to it if you come back, but 2 months from now, where are we? Lawsuit, no lawsuit? What do you think? And rehab, what do you think? Will Smith ends up at a rehab, maybe for anger management, some kind of issue?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't see Chris Rock filing a lawsuit over this. I really don't. I heard that, and I don't know, this is again not substantiated, but I did hear that they were going to speak after the ceremony. So I don't know if they actually got together to work it out. I know that there are other community members. So for example, Denzel Washington, Bradley Cooper, who were, involved to the extent that they were wanting to diffuse the situation. So I don't know if perhaps the support of the community will be enough to bring these two men together from what was, obviously something that should never have happened.
Now, in terms of your practice, because we really didn't talk too much about it to the viewers, and I really want to let them know, tell us a little bit of some of the work that you do outside of just talking on a show like this, actually.
Sure. So I actually represent some world touring comedians. So, this is something that struck close to home for me, so to speak. Imagining if this happened with one of my clients, a big part of what comedians do is crowd work. I'm at comedy shows all the time, and sometimes it's uncomfortable and sometimes it does, cross the line. But I represent comedians. I represent producers, directors, a lot of movies and TV shows that you've probably heard of. Primarily in film and TV space, but also books, music, and comedy.
Okay, final thought. Somebody's watching today and not necessarily want to take a side, but what would you tell them? Let's say they end up at a comedy show or a comedy club and they don't like what's being directed at them and they feel it's derogatory. What would you recommend to somebody sitting in that audience?
Well, the first thing would be stay in your seat. Okay. And if you don't like something, leave. I think that's the best way to approach it. If you really do feel the need to say something, then, I think walk away. It's the same rule with social media. Why are you following somebody that you don't like what they're saying? Instead, sitting there in the comments saying something, just walk away.
All right, entertainment lawyer Mitra Ahouraian from Los Angeles. Thanks for getting up early for us, and maybe come back in a couple of months and see how your predictions panned out. Okay.
I would love that. Interesting to see what happens.
Stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. All right, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have with us today State Senator Andrew Gounardes. State Senator, how are you doing today?
Well, we are in the midst of trying to finalize the state budget, so things are a little crazy, a little tense, but I'm glad to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
It's almost like an accountant during tax season, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Exactly.
the worst time of year to be an accountant.
With a $212 billion budget. That's
It always goes down to the last second. So I can only imagine. But with you today, and we appreciate your time because we know how busy you are, we're going to be talking about the home rule for New York City streets. Why don't you elaborate a little bit about it, and then we'll get into some specifics if you could.
Yeah, so basically it's this, not that crazy concept. Folks would probably be surprised to learn that Albany controls so many aspects of city life, especially when it comes to how the city can manage its own streets. We're talking about, if the city wants to lower the speed limit, it has to go to Albany to get permission. If the city wants to install X number of speed cameras by schools, it has to go to Albany for permission. If they want to install red light cameras, they have to go to Albany for permission. They have to go to Albany for permission to do all these things, which is like bonkers. I mean, from my perspective, why should a senator or an assembly member from Plattsburgh, New York, or Onondaga County, or Niagara Falls have any say about where New York City puts a red light camera? Or what the speed limit should be on Ocean Parkway? It doesn't make any sense.
And I went to school at Union College in Schenectady. All right. I remember very well what the traffic conditions were like. And it's very much different than Northern Boulevard or the Grand Concourse, which is about 15 feet behind me.
Yep.
So yes, I agree. Certainly the traffic conditions are different based on what county you are. New York County, Brooklyn, Kings Counties, Richmond County, or Schenectady County. What I'm really interested here is these speed cameras, because from what I'm reading, they actually turn off at a certain time, which I think is beyond ridiculous. What would make Albany think that's a good idea?
Well, it's one of those things where, it's like the sausage making of public policy, right? Like no one wants to see how sausage gets made. No one wants to see how laws get made. When I got into the Senate 3 years ago, we passed my bill to expand the number of speed cameras that were allowed to operate. Before I got there, the program had expired. We only were allowed to have 140 cameras, and they could only be on from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. Very limited time window. I get to Albany. I make a push to expand it to 750 school zones. That's about 2,000 cameras. And to expand it, we tried 24 hours, but we couldn't get the votes for that. So we had to settle for 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. on the theory that folks are going to and from school at all hours of the day. Some teachers are getting to school at 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. Kids are going for breakfast at 6:30, at 7. They're staying late for practice or play rehearsal, or there's a school board meeting or a PTA meeting, you name it. So that was the compromise we had to settle on 3 years ago. The program is coming up for renewal again this year. And as part of our renewal push, we are making the case to say these cameras should be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the data supports the fact that these cameras work at reducing speed. And by the way, if you look at the city's crash data, 60% of the crashes that have occurred with that result in serious injuries or fatalities have occurred in locations where a camera was installed, but they weren't allowed to be turned on. So like, what are we doing here? Why should there's no reason why they should be off.
What is the impetus? Is it money that you can't have something working 24 hours? Explain to me why an electronic camera that's just monitoring how fast you're going through an intersection can't be on all the time. What is the argument from the other side? It's got to be money. I can't imagine anything else.
No, I think folks are, at the time when we had this debate, there was some concern about the fact that these cameras, which were originally designed to be specifically in school zones, which is where they're currently installed, that there wasn't a need to have a camera turned on at 2 o'clock in the morning because kids aren't going to and from school.
What's the harm? What's the harm?
And that doesn't make that was the argument then. I think we've moved away from that point, and I think we can make a convincing case that there are people speeding at these times. There are people traveling the roads. There are essential workers working overnight shifts, going to and from their their place of employment at 1 a.m, 2 a.m, 3 a.m. They deserve protection too.
So are we talking just speed light cameras or red light cameras or both?
We're talking just speed light cameras. The red light cameras are a whole other issue. The city of New York can only have, by state law, only 150 red light cameras. That's like half of a neighborhood. There are 411 neighborhoods. There's about 10,000 intersections in New York City. Only 150 can have red light cameras. Again, doesn't make sense.
Lastly, let's talk about the local speed limits. You like them? You want them lower? I assume you don't want them higher. So what do you think? Home rule, tell me.
I think the city should be able to make that determination based on their expertise, based on the data. We know, based on evaluating thousands and thousands and thousands of points of data, that if you hit someone with your car at 20 miles an hour, you have a 20% chance of seriously injuring or killing them. If you hit them with a car at 40 miles an hour, you have an 80% chance of seriously injuring or killing someone. And if you hit someone at 30 miles an hour, it's a 50-50 shot, right? So we know that lower speeds actually help save lives, especially in a city as congested as New York City. Right now, the speed limit is 25. There are areas in the city that you can probably go down lower because it makes more safety sense. But again, Albany can't do that. New York City can't do that because Albany won't let them. So what we are fighting for is to give New York City the right to make their own determination, to say, look, we think that these blocks by certain schools or on certain highly dangerous corridors, we're going to lower the speed limit 5 miles an hour just so we can keep people safe. The city should be able to make those determinations and not have to come to Albany and ask for permission. And
what do you think? We're going to be successful in getting...
We are certainly going to do everything we can to make a push for it. I think it's common sense. I think it's a no-brainer. But you know what? It's Albany. It's politics. Things sometimes don't always go the way we think they should.
The only thing I ever really wanted sometimes, which you may not agree, is I always wanted to make a right on red in Manhattan. There are times when there's nobody around. There are times. Make a right on red. Okay, yes, there are pedestrians that are crossing. That wouldn't work. But I always felt there was a way that New York can figure out certain places to make a right on red, especially if it's like in the middle of the night when no one's around. But anyway,
there are a couple of places where you can do that in New York City. Again, because New York City has the authority right now to make those determinations. They should be able to have that authority to make all of our street safety determinations.
All of it. Good point. You convinced me on a lot of stuff, Andrew. We enjoyed having you. Hopefully you'll come back and we can
I'd love to.
How successful you are in trying to get this passed.
Thanks, David. Great being with you. Thank you.
It's our pleasure. All right, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Okay, that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our three guests for joining us, and of course you, the viewers, for watching. If you have a topic or issue that you would like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to email me at davidlesch@broxnet.org. Until the next time, know your issues, reach a verdict. We'll see you in 2 weeks.